In the rubble of bombed London, I learned something profound about human consciousness. The fragments scattered across the street were not merely destruction, they were the raw materials of reconstruction. This is the essential paradox of modern existence. We live in an age of fragments, yet wholeness remains not only possible but inevitable for those who understand the deeper architecture of experience. The wasteland was never truly waste. It was preparation. Each broken image, each disconnected voice, each cultural reference torn from its context, these are not signs of collapse but invitations to a more complete understanding. The question that haunts our century is not whether meaning exists, but whether we possess the patience and vision to assemble meaning from the scattered pieces of our inheritance. What appears as chaos to the untrained eye reveals itself as cosmos to the prepared mind. The fragments are not obstacles to wholeness, they are its very foundation. Chapter 1: The Necessity of Fragmentation. We must begin with a difficult truth: fragmentation is not the enemy of wholeness but its precondition. The unified cultures of the past, however beautiful in memory, could not survive contact with the expanded consciousness of modernity. We know too much now to return to the innocent simplicities of earlier ages. Consider the medieval cathedral, that perfect symbol of unified civilization. Every stone knew its place, every arch supported the whole, every window told part of a coherent story. But we cannot build such cathedrals today because we no longer inhabit that unified worldview. We have eaten from the tree of knowledge, scientific, psychological, anthropological, and there is no going back to Eden. This is not cause for despair but for profound excitement. The fragmentation of our time is like the deliberate breaking of bread before the feast. What appears as destruction is actually preparation for a higher form of nourishment. The modern consciousness, precisely because it can hold contradictions in tension, is capable of a more complete understanding than any previous era. When I wrote, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins," I was not describing defeat but strategy. The conscious artist does not lament the breaking of the old vessels but learns to work with the materials at hand. Every fragment contains within itself the memory of the whole from which it came. The poet's task is not to restore the original unity, that would be mere nostalgia, but to create new forms of wholeness that can incorporate the full complexity of modern awareness. The fragments of contemporary experience, the overheard conversation on the subway, the billboard glimpsed from a taxi window, the half-remembered line from a forgotten book, these are not distractions from meaning but the very substance from which meaning must be constructed. We live in a collage culture, and the artist who would speak to this culture must become master of the techniques of assemblage. This fragmentation extends beyond culture to consciousness itself. The modern self is not the unified identity of earlier ages but a collection of voices, influences, memories, and desires that must be orchestrated rather than simply expressed. The objective correlative emerges from this recognition: we need external structures that can hold the full complexity of internal experience without forcing it into false unity. Chapter 2: The Memory of Wholeness. Every fragment carries within itself the trace of its origin. This is the mystery that makes reconstruction possible. When we encounter a broken piece of pottery in an archaeological dig, we can often determine not only what vessel it came from but what civilization produced it. The fragment is never merely itself, it is always a synecdoche, a part that implies a whole. In language, this principle operates with particular force. Every word we use comes to us laden with the accumulated meanings of centuries. When I write, "April is the cruelest month," the word April arrives not naked but clothed in the associations of countless springs, countless poets, countless human experiences of renewal and disappointment. The fragment of language contains within itself the memory of all the contexts in which it has been used. This is why tradition is not the enemy of innovation but its deepest source. The truly original poet does not reject the past but enters into dialogue with it so intimate that new meanings emerge. When I allude to Dante or Shakespeare or the Buddha, I am not showing off my learning but activating the memories embedded in the language itself. These allusions are not ornaments but structural elements. They provide the framework that allows contemporary experience to achieve architectural coherence. The reader who complains that modern poetry is too elusive misses the point entirely. The allusions are not obstacles to understanding but pathways to a richer form of comprehension. They connect the immediate moment to the vast repository of human wisdom and experience. They remind us that we are not isolated individuals but participants in an ongoing conversation that stretches back to the beginning of recorded thought. But this memory of wholeness operates not only in literature but in consciousness itself. The deepest experiences of human life, love, death, spiritual awakening, artistic creation, have a quality of timelessness that connects us to all who have undergone similar experiences. In moments of profound insight, the boundaries between self and other, past and present, fragment and whole, dissolve temporarily to reveal the underlying unity that exists beneath the surface multiplicity. This is why the four quartets return obsessively to the theme of time. Linear time fragments experience into discrete moments, but there is another form of time, what I call the still point of the turning world, in which all moments coexist and the apparent succession of events reveals itself as an eternal pattern. The fragments of temporal experience are unified in this deeper dimension where all meanings converge. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Assembly. Understanding that fragments contain memories of wholeness is not enough. We must learn the principles by which these fragments can be consciously assembled into new forms of coherent meaning. This is the most practical aspect of my philosophy and the one most relevant to anyone seeking to create order from the chaos of contemporary experience. The first principle is juxtaposition without explanation. When fragments from different contexts are placed in proximity, they begin to speak to each other in ways that explicit commentary would only diminish. The thunder-speaking Sanskrit in the wasteland gains its power not from scholarly footnotes but from its sudden appearance in a landscape of urban despair. The contrast creates meaning that neither element could achieve alone. This technique mirrors the way consciousness itself actually operates. We do not experience life as a logical sequence of explained events but as a stream of impressions, memories, anticipations, and sensations that create meaning through their patterns of association. The modernist collage technique is more realistic than traditional narrative because it better approximates the actual texture of awareness. The second principle is the identification of recurring motifs. Fragments may seem random when encountered individually, but patterns emerge when we learn to recognize the underlying themes that connect apparently disparate elements. The Fisher King appears in the wasteland not as a single symbol but as a recurring presence that transforms our understanding of every context in which we encounter images of wounding, healing, drought, and restoration. These motifs function like musical themes in a symphony. They undergo variation and development. They appear in different keys and orchestrations. They combine and separate and recombine. But their underlying identity provides the structural coherence that allows the work to function as a unified artistic statement despite its surface complexity. The third principle is the cultivation of what I call patient receptivity. The meaning of assembled fragments cannot be grasped through aggressive analysis but only through a kind of meditative attention that allows the connections to emerge naturally. This requires a fundamental reorientation from the habit of demanding immediate comprehension to the practice of trusting that meaning will reveal itself to sustained contemplation. This patience is not passive but actively creative. It involves holding multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously without premature closure, allowing contradictory interpretations to coexist until a higher synthesis emerges. It requires what Keats called negative capability, the ability to remain in uncertainties and doubts without irritably reaching after fact and reason. The final principle is the recognition that wholeness, when achieved, is always provisional and open to further development. The fragments are not assembled once and for all but continue to reveal new patterns of relationship as our understanding deepens and our perspective expands. Chapter 4: The Sacred Dimension of Fragmentation. There is a spiritual dimension to fragmentation that our secular age has largely forgotten but which remains essential to any complete understanding of wholeness. The breaking apart of established forms is often the necessary prelude to religious awakening. The mystics of all traditions speak of the dark night of the soul, that period of apparent meaninglessness and disorientation that precedes authentic spiritual insight. In the Christian tradition, this principle is encoded in the central mystery of death and resurrection. The grain of wheat must fall into the ground and die before it can bear much fruit. What appears as destruction is revealed, from the perspective of eternity, as transformation. The fragmentation of the ego is not the end of spiritual life but its beginning. This pattern repeats at every level of experience. The breaking up of false unities, whether in personal identity, cultural institutions, or intellectual systems, creates the space in which authentic wholeness can emerge. The comfortable certainties of childhood must be shattered before mature understanding becomes possible. The conventional pieties of society must be questioned before genuine wisdom can be achieved. But this spiritual dimension of fragmentation is not merely destructive. It is profoundly creative because it opens consciousness to dimensions of reality that were previously hidden. When the familiar frameworks of understanding collapse, we become available to forms of truth that transcend ordinary rational comprehension. The fragments of broken meaning become windows through which larger realities become visible. This is why my poetry increasingly turned toward explicitly religious themes as my understanding deepened. The Wasteland documents the spiritual crisis of modernity, but the four quartets explore the possibilities for renewal that emerge when that crisis is fully accepted and worked through. The fragments of secular culture, when properly understood, point toward transcendent realities that give ultimate meaning to human existence. The tradition of Christian mysticism provides particularly powerful resources for understanding this process. The Via Negativa, the way of negation, teaches that God can be approached not through positive statements but through the systematic removal of all inadequate conceptions. The fragments of broken theology, when subjected to this process of purification, can become vehicles for authentic spiritual insight. But this spiritual dimension is not limited to explicitly religious contexts. Every genuine encounter with beauty, truth, or goodness partakes of this same pattern of fragmentation and reconstruction. The overwhelming encounter with artistic greatness shatters our previous aesthetic categories and reconstructs them at a higher level. The discovery of previously unknown truth breaks apart our established intellectual frameworks and reorganizes them in more adequate forms. The experience of genuine love dissolves the boundaries of the isolated self and reveals deeper patterns of connection and meaning. The key insight is that the sacred dimension is not separate from ordinary experience but is the deepest level of ordinary experience when properly understood. The fragments of everyday life, properly attended to, reveal themselves as sacraments of transcendent reality. Chapter 5: The Psychology of Integration. The reconstruction of wholeness from fragments is not merely an intellectual or artistic process but a psychological one that involves the deepest structures of human consciousness. We must understand how the mind actually works with broken materials before we can hope to master the techniques of meaningful assembly. The first psychological principle is that consciousness naturally seeks pattern and meaning, even in the most chaotic circumstances. This is not a learned behavior but an inherent tendency of awareness itself. When fragments are presented to consciousness, the mind immediately begins searching for connections, relationships, and underlying unities. The poet's task is not to create these patterns but to arrange the fragments in such a way that the mind's natural pattern-seeking activity is engaged productively. This process operates largely below the threshold of conscious awareness. The connections between fragments are often felt before they are understood. We sense that certain combinations are right without being able to explain why. This intuitive recognition of meaningful pattern is one of the most reliable guides we have in the work of assembly. It suggests that there are deep structures of meaning that transcend individual consciousness and connect us to larger patterns of significance. The second principle is that integration requires the acceptance of contradiction without the demand for immediate resolution. The modern consciousness is distinguished by its ability to hold opposing ideas in tension without forcing them into premature synthesis. This capacity, which I call mature ambiguity, is essential for dealing with the complexity of contemporary experience. Traditional forms of consciousness demanded that contradictions be resolved quickly through the elimination of one side or the other. But the fragmented nature of modern experience makes such simple resolution impossible. We must learn to live creatively with paradox, allowing contradictory truths to coexist until a higher form of understanding emerges that can encompass both without denying either. This psychological capacity is closely related to what psychologists call tolerance of ambiguity, the ability to function effectively in situations where the meaning is unclear or multiple interpretations are possible. But the integration of fragments requires more than mere tolerance. It requires the active cultivation of what we might call creative uncertainty, the recognition that the most meaningful insights often emerge from the productive tension between conflicting perspectives. The third principle is that the process of integration transforms not only the fragments but the consciousness that performs the integration. We cannot remain unchanged observers of the assembly process. The work of putting fragments together changes us at the deepest level, expanding our capacity for complexity, deepening our tolerance for mystery, and strengthening our faith in the possibility of meaning even in the most difficult circumstances. This transformation is often experienced as a kind of death and rebirth. The self that begins the process of integration is not the same self that completes it. Old patterns of thinking and feeling must be abandoned to make room for new forms of understanding. This can be a painful process, but it is the only way that genuine growth occurs. The final principle is that the integrated consciousness becomes capable of what I call stereoscopic vision, the ability to see multiple levels of meaning simultaneously without losing focus on any particular level. Like binocular vision, which combines two slightly different perspectives to create depth perception, psychological integration allows us to perceive the dimensional quality of experience that remains invisible to purely analytical approaches. Chapter 6: The Cultural Work of Reconstruction. The integration of fragments is not merely a personal psychological process but a cultural necessity. Our civilization stands at a crossroads where the old forms of unity have been irreversibly shattered, but new forms of coherence have not yet emerged. The work of reconstruction is perhaps the most urgent task facing contemporary culture. The fragmentation of modern culture is not accidental but systematic. The forces of industrialization, urbanization, mass communication, and technological change have broken apart the traditional communities and belief systems that once provided automatic sources of meaning and identity. We live in what sociologists call the lonely crowd, connected to vast networks of information and commerce but disconnected from the intimate communities that once sustained human identity. But this cultural fragmentation, like its personal equivalent, is not merely destructive. It has liberated consciousness from parochial limitations and opened us to influences from across the globe and across history. We have access to the wisdom of all traditions, the art of all cultures, the insights of all epochs. The challenge is not to return to the narrow certainties of the past but to create new forms of unity that can incorporate this expanded awareness without losing coherence. The work of cultural reconstruction requires what I call conscious tradition, the deliberate selection and creative combination of elements from the vast storehouse of human achievement. This is different from both unconscious traditionalism, which simply repeats inherited patterns without understanding, and anti-traditionalism, which rejects the past wholesale in favor of rootless innovation. Conscious tradition recognizes that the past is not a burden to be discarded but a resource to be actively appropriated. It understands that genuine innovation emerges not from the rejection of influence but from the creative synthesis of multiple influences. It sees that the fragments of inherited culture can be combined in new ways to create forms of meaning that are both rooted in tradition and responsive to contemporary needs. This process is already visible in the most vital expressions of contemporary culture. Jazz music exemplifies conscious tradition in its creative combination of African rhythms, European harmonies, and American social experience. Abstract expressionist painting demonstrates how fragments of multiple artistic traditions can be synthesized to create new forms of visual meaning. Modern architecture shows how traditional functional principles can be adapted to contemporary materials and social requirements. The key insight is that cultural reconstruction cannot be accomplished by experts working in isolation but requires the active participation of the entire community. Every individual who takes seriously the work of integrating the fragments of contemporary experience contributes to the larger cultural project. Every reader who struggles to understand difficult poetry, every viewer who contemplates challenging art, every citizen who thinks seriously about the meaning of democracy in the modern world, participates in the collective work of cultural renewal. This is why education in the humanities remains essential despite the pressure for purely technical training. The humanities provide the tools for understanding how fragments of meaning can be assembled into coherent wholes. They teach the patience and sensitivity required for meaningful cultural work. They connect us to the vast conversation of human understanding that transcends any particular period or place. Chapter 7: The Practice of Wholeness. Having understood the theoretical principles, we must now turn to the practical question: how does one actually live in such a way that fragments become wholeness? This is not merely an artistic or intellectual problem but an existential one that every conscious person must address. The first practice is what I call attentive gathering. This involves developing the habit of paying careful attention to the fragments of experience as they present themselves, without immediately trying to organize or interpret them. Like a careful archaeologist, we must learn to preserve the integrity of each fragment while remaining alert to possible connections with other discoveries. This practice requires a fundamental reorientation from the modern habit of consuming experience rapidly and superficially to the older discipline of contemplative attention. It means slowing down enough to actually see what is before us, to hear what is being said, to feel what is being felt. It means resisting the constant pressure to move on to the next thing before we have fully received what is currently available. Most people experience their lives as a blur of disconnected events precisely because they never pause long enough to allow the connections to become visible. The practice of attentive gathering creates the space in which meaningful patterns can emerge. It is the prerequisite for all deeper forms of integration. The second practice is patient assembly. Once we have gathered a collection of carefully observed fragments, we must learn to work with them creatively without forcing premature conclusions. This is like learning to solve a complex puzzle. We must trust that the pieces will eventually reveal their proper relationships if we persist with intelligent attention. This practice requires developing what contemplatives call holy patience, the ability to remain engaged with difficult material without demanding immediate gratification. It means learning to tolerate the anxiety that comes with not knowing, the discomfort that accompanies complexity, the frustration that emerges when simple answers prove inadequate. But this patience is not passive resignation. It is actively creative waiting, the kind of attention that allows new possibilities to emerge. It involves holding multiple interpretations simultaneously until a more complete understanding crystallizes. It requires the discipline of neither accepting the first plausible explanation nor giving up when initial attempts fail. The third practice is integrated living. The goal of fragmentary awareness is not merely intellectual understanding but transformed existence. We must learn to live in such a way that the insights gained through the work of integration actually shape our daily choices and relationships. This means allowing the deeper patterns that emerge from contemplative attention to guide practical decisions. It means bringing the same quality of careful attention to ordinary activities that we bring to the study of poetry or philosophy. It means recognizing that every moment offers opportunities for meaningful connection if we are properly prepared to receive them. The practice of integrated living extends to our relationships with other people. When we learn to see others as complex beings whose apparent contradictions may actually reflect deeper wholeness, our capacity for compassion and understanding expands dramatically. We become less quick to judge and more able to appreciate the hidden coherence that underlies even difficult behavior. The final practice is creative offering. The wholeness that emerges from integrated awareness is not meant to be hoarded but shared. Whether through art, teaching, service, or simply the quality of presence we bring to ordinary encounters, we must find ways to contribute to the larger cultural work of reconstruction. This offering takes many forms, but it always involves making visible the connections and meanings that contemplative attention has revealed. It means helping others to see the beauty and significance that are available even in the most fragmented circumstances. Conclusion. The fragments will not cease to be fragments. The complexity of modern life will not suddenly simplify. The easy certainties of earlier ages will not return to comfort us. But none of this matters if we understand that wholeness was never about the absence of fragmentation but about the conscious integration of complexity into meaningful pattern. Every broken thing carries within itself the memory of what it once was and the possibility of what it might become. Every fragment of experience, when attended to with sufficient patience and skill, reveals connections that lead toward larger understanding. Every individual who undertakes this work of conscious integration contributes to the renewal of civilization itself. The wasteland becomes fertile ground when we learn to read the signs correctly. The fragments shore themselves against our ruins when we develop the architectural vision to see how they fit together. The still point of the turning world becomes accessible to those who understand that wholeness is not a destination but a way of traveling through the complexity of existence. This is the promise that has sustained me through decades of cultural fragmentation and personal uncertainty, that meaning is not destroyed by complexity but deepened by it, that truth is not weakened by multiplicity but strengthened by it, and that the conscious work of integration transforms both the fragments and the consciousness that assembles them into something greater than either could achieve alone. Begin where you are, with what you have. The wholeness you seek is already present in the fragments you carry,